Okay. Peter, did you want to start off with any?
Yeah, I mean, I think I think we can jump straight into it. It's small group, so everybody should have received the agenda, and we'll do kind of brief update on FMP progress, touch base briefly on the conversation on the extensive silviculture that happened last week, and then Shannon, we have opportunity for you to give a high-level overview of the adaptive research chapter, which everybody received, as well as the aquatic and riparian chapter, which folks should have access to in your email. Wrap up and get you out of here no later than 12 o'clock. We have 10 minutes reserved for public comment if we have members of the public join us. And I think that's it. And I think, Shannon, you can go ahead and get started.
Okay, sounds good.
Paul is joining shortly here, so I will, I got to get him the link.
Okay, and it looks like I need screen sharing enabled.
Do that.
So I just have a couple of slides as an overview. Thanks, Peter. But really wanted to spend the majority of the time today discussing the two draft sections that were sent out specifically for discussion at this meeting. The first is the adaptive approach, and the second is the aquatic and riparian system section. And I believe Gordy Reeves should be joining us too at some point in the meeting. And so he'll be available to help answer any questions and help take feedback on those as well. So a brief overview of some recent progress on the forest management plan. The forest inventory based on the 2021 LIDAR was completed in September with approximately 10.3 million trees and dominant and co-dominant as part of that inventory. So we're starting to work with that data, and a PhD student of Bogdan's who helped with the forest inventory as well as some of the ground-based LIDAR and drone LIDAR work this summer. And he is working with us directly on that database as we start to use that data for this next phase of developing information for the forest management plan. Checking in on another piece that we had discussed at the last meeting of this group specifically, but as well as the advisory committee meeting in September. Back in August, we had put together some proposed stand level treatment reallocations with a criteria and process, and presented that to this group and had a discussion about that process and how the criteria were being applied. We got the go-ahead to move forward and apply that same process to the remaining sub-watersheds in the MRW. And so those reallocations are near complete. We expect them to be completed this week, and we'll be sharing those out to this group the same way that we shared the information back in August. So we'll put together a PDF packet that has, again, the process, the criteria, and slides showing the proposed changes before and after. And just a reminder that this is one step in the process. This is an important step because it feeds into the modeling and analyses that are happening right now. But there will be, we anticipate that there will be additional adjustments made in the future with more information and information from on the ground. We also have been continuing to edit draft sections that we have released. And so there were several sections released in the summer, and then again, ahead of the September 7th advisory committee meeting. We got some really good input from advisory committee members, as well as stakeholders in the general public through that advisory committee meeting, through written feedback, and through a public listening session that we had in September. So we are reviewing all that information, incorporating edits into those documents, and we'll be sharing updated sections back with the FMP working group. And there will be further opportunities, of course, to provide input. We'll have another listening session in October and one in November, as well as more FMP working group meetings and advisory committee meetings. So we'll be sharing information ahead of time on all of those sections. Another piece that we've been working on is the marbled murrelet experiment draft. And this has gone through multiple rounds with that technical group and is nearing a stage where we anticipate sharing it with this FMP working group. We wanted to get one more round of comments from the technical group working on it before sharing that out with this group. But you should expect to see that draft information very soon. And then finally, as I mentioned, we've been we have a series of public listening sessions, advisory committee meetings, and FMP working group meetings in October and November. The next upcoming public session is going to be in person down at Southwestern Oregon Community College on October 18th. And there will be the opportunity for people to join via live stream. That'll also be recorded. And we have a system set up for people to submit questions and comments ahead of time if they're joining remotely. And of course, if you're in person, then you would be able to ask questions directly there. And alongside all of this, there have been some updates going on to the OSU Elliott webpage. And so all of this information is there, as well as we are getting up links to the most current versions of the draft sections so that information will always be available at a link. And that should hopefully help people make sure that they're looking at the same versions. All of the drafts will be dated and have version numbers. Next, I just wanted to touch on a discussion that came out of the September 7th advisory committee meeting. There was a really good discussion about level of detail in the forest management plan. This came up specifically around extensive, but also applies to many sections of the forest management plan. And there was input given from different members of the advisory committee, as well as OSU, about level of detail in the experimental design in the forest management plan versus flexibility needed, and what information would be most appropriate in a forest management plan versus a biennial operations plan for this type of a research forest, which is unique. And so coming out of that meeting, there was a conversation organized with the extensive technical group and several members of the advisory committee, some of whom are here and part of the FMP working group. And so that first discussion, which was last week, really talked about flexibility, level of detail, as I said, sort of trade-offs and approaches for information that would be in the forest management plan and subject to the review and approvals that are outlined in the legislation versus biennial operations plans and what the legislation anticipates would be in those types of documents. And the group talked about developing a process that maintains the ability to make adjustments to the experimental design and management that goes hand in hand with that, based on the stated objectives of extensive that are in the forest management plan in draft form right now, but are being continuing to be worked on, and the monitoring indicators that are part of the forest management plan. And this really ties into the adaptive approach that's envisioned for the forest. And this also ties really today to one of the discussions that we'd like to have with this group about the draft adaptive chapter that was shared. But those are sort of the high level pieces of conversation from that meeting last week. I wanted to ask any members of the FMP working group who were part of that discussion, if you'd like to share your takeaways or your thoughts from that conversation, just so that this whole FMP working group has the same level of understanding about what that meeting was about.
Any high-level reflections?
Yeah, I think you said it pretty well, Shannon. There was just from some of us, including me, there was a concern of the level of detail in the monitoring indicators in the forest management plan itself would not lend itself to adaptive management. That through implementation and monitoring, that some of the numbers contained within the existing FMP draft would need to be revised and refined, and that by writing them into the FMP, it would make it really difficult to revise those, since the FMP, the process for revising the FMP is pretty onerous.
Thanks, Colin. More to come on this piece. And part of that also relates to, as Shannon, as you said, one of our topics today. Bob, did you have something you want to share? Just high level reflection.
Yeah, just sorry, following my college comments. I think we do see it differently. Maybe a matter of degree. I think we're still working through it, but there were details that sorry, I'm choking here on some food that OSU assured folks they would put into the FMP, and I think it's important that we remain true to that as we go forward as well, so that we can see those details. It is different in that it's a research forest, but at the same time, there are other values at play, and I think it's important that OSU be clear on some of those details in terms of what the public can expect on the landscape, and also from a scientific perspective as well, so that we actually have targets that we're trying to achieve, and we can see if we accomplish those. So I think it fits in both with the research paradigm, but also sort of that public forest aspect of it as well.
Thanks, Bob. Thanks, Colin. And as I said, more to come, and we're still sort of working through this piece, but wanted to get everybody sort of a glimpse into that conversation. With that, Shannon, I think we can turn our attention to the adaptive research section.
Okay, great. So yeah, this is actually a really good connection to the adaptive research chapter. There was a draft shared ahead of this meeting. So again, welcome any feedback on this chapter, either through written comments or here at the meeting, or any avenue that this working group would like to connect with us on. Just again, a high level overview of some of the main parts of the draft chapter at this stage. There's a description of the phased implementation of the triad experiment. And it follows the figure that's shown here, which is pulled from that draft. This is sort of an updated and more detailed version of the figure that was in the research proposal that outlined what the adaptive process looked like. And so, this really gets into, let me move my Zoom bar here so I can see it. This really gets into the pieces, some of which we're engaging in right now. So you can see, up at the top with A, landscape analysis, selecting sub-watersheds, allocating treatments at the stand level, developing criteria or outcomes that would indicate changes in the experimental design, and then moving towards exploring scientific and social acceptability of protocol changes, designing and implementing the monitoring protocols, implementing treatments, monitoring and assessing using the framework that was shared as part of the monitoring plan draft, and then making adjustments to the experimental design and associated management as needed. So that's kind of the outer loop here, but you can see there are smaller loops indicated, and these two shown here may not be the only two, but these are two of the major ones where if you go through this process of monitoring assessment, if it's determined that an adjustment is needed, then you would continue to analyze data at a landscape scale, and potentially then have the information you need to make adjustments and implement treatments, or continue on the path that you're on if adjustments aren't indicated, or it may indicate that a broader change might be needed, in which case you might go back to a step that involves looking at the criteria outcomes that you were aiming towards, or the monitoring protocols that were put in place if you're not detecting the signals that you anticipated you might be able to. So that the chapter outlines this process in more detail. Also, it reframes the adaptive management approach as more of an adaptive research or adaptive experimental design approach. And this came out of the September 7th advisory committee meeting and the discussion that happened there about adaptive management, some of the pitfalls that often happen where a strategy of adaptive management is the goal, and that's what a team is working for, but either the monitoring isn't in place, or the steps to take the information that you have and then apply it and make it an actionable item in a land management context don't always happen. And so that conversation caused our team to go back and do some thinking about how that applies to the Elliott State Research Forest, the fact that it is a research forest based on this experimental design with a strong system of monitoring protocols, and really think about how we might want to draw a distinction between adaptive management that typically happens in a land management context versus how does adaptive management fit within an experimental or research context that then triggers changes in management based on the experimental design. So there are some clarifications in the chapter just trying to get at that distinction and also make the connection between an adaptive approach and an experimental approach. Part of that is outlining sort of a tiered approach and a draft framework for level of review. And this again came out of the conversation with the advisory committee at the September meeting, and thinking again about decision-making processes and what is in a forest management plan versus what is in a biennial operations plan. And within the forest management plan, what sort of mechanisms or processes need to be in place so that adjustments could be made in conversation with the board of directors of the authority and the research management team on the forest. So this is one of the things that we'd really like to discuss with this group today in more detail. And then the chapter also has draft examples of monitoring indicators and adaptive design responses. There is a note that these are still in development, and that's a continued process as we work on different sections of the forest management plan that are really closely connected, making sure that we incorporate feedback that we're getting, and then also continue to update these examples of monitoring indicators and responses. So there's a lot of text on this slide, but this is basically taking directly from that document the tiered approach. So I wanted to have this text up in front of everybody because it would be really great to discuss this and get feedback from this group. Basically, the draft lays out this tiered approach where at one level you would have the adaptations that are typical of the scientific process and part of a research experimental design. And so the proposed approach here is that that formal approval for this type of change wouldn't be required and isn't indicated under the forest management plan or the legislation, but changes would be communicated with more frequent communications as needed with the board, and then more formally presented through biennial operations plans and reports. And this is an ongoing process in experimental design, so no set timeline. The purpose would be adjusting scientific experiments and monitoring needed due to variability in ecological systems and technological advances and what we have funding for. Maybe a new grant comes in that allows for additional monitoring. So those are just some of the things that the group is considering. And I think I saw Gordy on come into the meeting, and Gordy, I didn't know from the riparian side, which we're going to talk about a little bit later in the meeting, if you had thoughts on this and maybe an example of how this would apply to what you've been developing.
Yeah, I mean, I think I can give you an example that might fit into each of these categories. So a major focus of the riparian research will be on restoration of the RCA, the riparian conservation areas, and we're proposing to be able to operate within the entirety of the designated riparian areas, which is different than what's been done previously. So we know we're going to have to be really diligent in terms of the monitoring. And there are a couple examples here I could give of some changes that might be made. So one is we're going to, we set a limit at which we would thin the stands to, and it's like, I want to say 80 square feet per acre of conifers. That's what the foresters have suggested is the level that we should thin to see a response in terms of growth. And so one of the immediate things that it might be with the scientific experiment adaptation, something like that, is if we don't see the level of growth that we were expecting, we might make some type of changes in terms of the level of thinning that would happen. Concurrent with that would be we're going to be monitoring water temperature. If we see the temperatures are maybe going up at a faster rate or increasing at a rate faster than what we wanted, we'd have to make changes. And we've already proposed a 5-year window in which we'll do this work initially. So we want to make sure that what we're doing is going to achieve the results, and we're not going to be too far into it before we have to make any changes. So we would be looking at water temperatures and saying, are they responding in the way we would expect? And if not, what type of adjustment? That might be sort of a minor adaptive change here. One that might be more substantial, and it's been raised more recently, is there's concerns because what we're proposing is leaving the wood that is harvested in the first 120 feet will either be devoted to the stream channel to increase, to jumpstart the wood loading in the channels, or it will be left on the forest floor. There's been an issue that's come to our attention recently about Douglas fir bark beetles and potential that this could be a site for the infestation of Douglas fir bark beetles. If something like that were to occur, and we saw that the population of the beetle were really exploding in these areas where we were leaving wood, we would have to make some pretty substantial changes in terms of what we were going to do with that wood.
And Gordy, just as a point of clarification, are you describing now the second category of adaptations?
The second one would be water temperature, I think. The third one with the bark beetles might be a more substantial change.
Substantial change to the FMP. Got it.
Yeah, you know, that we would have to come and talk to people about what are we, because of the, you know, what are we going to do with that wood? And if we're going to start removing it, there's concerns being expressed by nymphs about the removal. So I think we would have to go back and have a real serious discussion about what's going to happen with that, with the wood that we're proposing to use. So you can, you know, that it's going to depend on the effect and the extent of the effect that we see where we would go with these. But those are just 3 types of things I think that I could see fitting into this approach.
Thanks for that, Gordy. So yeah, Gordy touched on all three of the parts of this tiered approach. So one being, again, the scientific experimentation level. A second would be more of a minor adaptive change that would require approval from the board of directors and would be approximately on a general timeline of every 2 years through the biennial reports and operation plans, versus something that would be more of a substantial change to the forest management plan and would most likely require a science review by an external peer science advisory group, as well as approval of the board of directors. And based on the legislation, this type of change at the forest management plan level would also require a discussion with the state land board. So the general timeline on this would be more on the order of every 10 years. So thanks for providing some examples of how you would see this applying, Gordy, to the work that you're doing. This ties really closely with some of the conversations that were happening around extensive silviculture, but this really is something that would apply to the entire forest and research design. So that's why we have it in this chapter on adaptation. But I get at this point really like to open it up to the working group here and get your input and thoughts on this and any suggestions that you have.
Thanks, Shannon. Are folks able to visualize this sufficiently that we could maybe stop sharing and see each other a little bit better? And then Colin, I'll come to you first. And Paul, I know you have a shorter time horizon here, so I'll maybe give you the mic after Colin if you want it. Go ahead, Colin.
Thanks. So yeah, I wanted to say that the adaptive management section overall, I think it's really well thought out and written and organized. So, overall, I think we're on the right track. I did get a chance to look through it yesterday and made a few notes where I had some concerns and I thought some tweaks would be helpful. And this was one of those areas. So while we're here, I'll address that. I think that there are going to be different categories of adaptive management that require different levels of review and approval. But I think that in the draft section as it's written, it's really subjective and vague what changes would require what level of approval. And if that's the case, I think the result is going to be that we play it safe on everything, and every change requires approval by the state land board. It's going to be subject to debate, and which means it's going to be subject to litigation. So I think you need to spell out very clearly beforehand what different things fall into each category. And I think the way you do that is, things that are written into the FMP itself under the legislation require the state land board to approve if there's a modification to the FMP. So the things that we want to have that higher level of discussion and approval, you write those into the FMP. Things that you want that are a little bit lower level, like changing the basal area target for thinning and riparian areas, you want to have a little bit higher level of discussion, but probably not take those to the full land board. So you include those in the operations plan. They get discussed, they get approved by the Elliott authority. And then the lower level things, like, for example, if you're changing your field protocol for field work, I don't know, how you sample water quality or take temperatures, if you're changing those protocols, or if you're gating a road because of resource damage, those are things that you want to be able to do that quickly. You don't want to have to wait for approval of a new biennial operations plan. So you spell that out in the biennial operations plan, that those will be addressed separately. There will be a separate document that spells out, for example, the procedures for gating a road or the procedures for doing water quality sampling. So I guess my point is that we really need to make clear what different actions, adaptive actions require what levels of approval and place them in documents accordingly. And this ties back to my concerns with the level of detail that's in the current forest management plan. Is any changes to the forest management plan require approval by the Department of State, the state land boards. And currently there's a level of detail in the forest management plan that is not conducive, I think, to adaptive management. We need to be able to make these tweaks and adjustments on a shorter time frame without making it politicized by taking it to the state land board.
Thanks, Colin. Paul, I don't want to put you on the spot, but I do want to make sure you have a chance. You can pause if.
No, that's okay. I'm prepared to vent and rant at a moment's notice. Anything that isn't in the legislation, we shouldn't put in the legislation now. Anything that we can keep out of a land board decision, we should. Anything that we depend on them to change won't get changed. And Gordy's example of the pine beetle potential is a perfect example. If we find that leaving that material out on the ground is actually detrimental to the forest, it will be, if we have to go to the land board, it'll be just about impossible to change. I think it will be impossible to change. So any of those things that we can short couple, that we can keep within OSU, making suggestions and the board making decisions. I think it's critical that we do that. Stuff that requires a change from the legislation obviously has to go back to legislation, but we don't want to give them any more authority than they've already got. It will tie OSU's hands to where it will be impossible to manage this forest. So while Bob has repeatedly said they wanted more detail, more detail in the forest management plan, I want less. And in my perfect world, there would be almost no detail in it, and it would be left to the board and OSU to manage this forest. That's the intent.
Thanks, Paul. Any other high-level feedback? I'm curious, reactions to the concept of, appropriate amount of detail, but sort of even at a higher level, sort of the tiered approach to structuring how you think about changes like that. Does that concept work for you as an approach to thinking about adaptive management, adaptive research, that there are different categories and trying to specify those? Bob, that looks like you're saying thumbs up to that. And yeah, Colin.
Yeah, I like the tiered approach. I think you just need to define what goes into each tier beforehand, so that when something comes along and you need to make a change, you know what level of review and approval is required, and you're not having to decide that when the time comes to make that change.
Yeah, I think it's sort of delineating what fits into which category potentially. Although there's always challenges, and you naming every single type of decision is always challenging. So it's, I think, a combination of like either examples or what types of decisions fit into which categories, as well as the process through which those decisions are made, which kind of builds on some of the conversation you all had in the extensive
Yeah, I don't think it's difficult because I think the work's already been done in the legislation. The legislation requires the FMP, changes to the FMP are approved by the land board. And that the biennial operations plan are approved by the research authority without the need for additional approval by the land
Right.
board. So you already have the categories in place. You just need to figure out which level of detail to put into each category. How much detail do you put into the forest management plan? How much detail do you put into the biennial operations plan? And how much detail do you leave out of the biennial operations plan, which would be the lowest level of approval. So the categories are already there. And that's the discussion that we've been having. That's the discussion we had last week, is how much detail you
Right.
put in each of those documents.
Thanks for clarifying. Any other feedback, reactions from advisory committee, or things OSU team that you would like feedback on?
I just would like to ask for some feedback on a sticky piece about this, because I hear what both of you are saying, and I'm trying to see it through the lens of a researcher. And so when we start an experiment, we typically start with a design, and the design has to be balanced, it has to be unbiased. Otherwise, the outputs, the outcomes from the design can't be interpreted from a statistical or unbiased way. And so part of doing that is setting some targets and some goals and some treatment levels. And, we often say that if you want to see a response in a natural system, you kind of have to make a difference, right? You can't be nuanced in some of those treatments. Otherwise, you won't see a response that's statistically explainable. You have to do some manipulative experiments so that you can learn cause and effect some. So there's different kinds of experimentation, from just purely observational to manipulative. And so those things are really important to us from a scientific standpoint. And I don't know where they belong, but we need that. We need to be able to say, we need X replicates. We need these different levels of thinning, whether we call it high, low, or medium, or whatever, but we need to be able to say what those are going to be. And then also, once we start to implement and learn things, we need to be able to change those to some degree, but we need to do it in a process, again, that's unbiased in terms of science. And so what I'm concerned about is, in both sides, I hear both of you really loud and clearly, but I'm not quite sure how to put it in the context of an experiment where we're looking at things at a larger level. So some help there would be appreciated.
Thanks, Katie. So Bob, then Ken, then Colin. You solicited feedback, and it looks like you're going to get some.
It's okay.
Well, I mean, I think it is difficult because we're talking sort of a theoretical universe here. I think Katie, that the things we're concerned about are increased harvest levels, impacting older forests above and beyond the expectations, which are still not entirely clear, and those kinds of things. How much. Where do you fall along that continuum of 80% to 20% in the those areas? What is the real balance over a 5-year time frame, for example? What does it really look like when we get in and do the restoration harvest? So there's a lot of question marks, and I guess the question that I would reflect back to you is, I totally get the need to make change and then see what happens. My take would be, but correct me if I'm wrong, is that it's going to take a fairly long amount of time to really get the kind of data that is going to cause you to say, we want to do something radically different. Obviously, you're going to try a variety of different treatments across the landscape and collect the data on those. But it's not like you're going to come back in 2 years and say, we found out that if we thin at this level, sedimentation goes up relative to whatever. And so we're going to stop doing that right now. I mean, that's going to take a long time to get those kinds of results that would cause you to do some pretty significant landscape changes in terms of what you're laying out on the ground. And so I just wonder if we're kind of going around on something that isn't that important, because it seems like to me the first 10 to 20 years, really you have to figure out what you want to do, how you're going to array it on the landscape, and then do it. And it's probably going to be 10 to 20 years before you actually really modify it in ways that would kick us back up to the land board. Sorry, that was a long way of saying that, but am I misreading that at all?
I'm trying to get, like, you're right, there's long-term and there's short-term impacts of anything that's done. And our goal is to understand the long-term impacts. So from a scientific standpoint, wouldn't be surprised if we saw some immediate positive impacts and some immediate negative impacts. And what our interests are is how those change through time. Do the negative impacts get amplified, or does the system reset? Do they turn eventually into positive impacts? I mean, I think probably one of the best explanations that, or I guess metaphors that I hear from a researcher comes out of Dana Warren frequently. And he talks about stream restoration as being kind of like a house renovation, kitchen renovation. That you have a kitchen that's functioning, it's not functioning very well maybe, so you decide you're going to renovate it. You go through a renovation phase. During that renovation, you can't use your kitchen, right? It's dysfunctional. And eventually, when it all gets put back together, it actually increases the function. And so if you start thinking about that as a way, and so if you get into that relatively dysfunctional stage and you think, oh, the flags go off and you shut everything down, then you're never going to see the long-term stage, because you'll change your research and you no longer can look at cause and effect from the initial standpoint, because you've moved the goalposts or whatever, so you can't go back to the old ones. And so that you lose that long-term picture. And if there's anything that the H.J. Andrews has taught us, is that long-term picture is what gives us the clarity and understanding of not only what impacts are, but also how the system adjusts and what are the mechanisms of that adjustment. And so that's kind of in a large theoretical underpinning where we're coming from. And so we want some things to happen. We want to see differences in our treatments. And we then want to see the long-term effects of the differences of those treatments. But we're also in the reality of working in a space with endangered species. And so if our treatments affect the endangered species, whether they be fish or birds, then we're in a whole different ball game of what we can allow while our kitchen is dysfunctional. And so it's kind of putting those things together in a format that's challenging.
And I know people want to go, but just to follow very quickly, I feel like you're making my point though, which is that you want to do these experiments over the long haul. So it doesn't sound like you're going to be making, for the most part, I understand there could be exceptions, but major changes in terms of adaptive management in the short term. You know that some of these things you're getting a take permit for this exact reason. You know some things are going to have negative impacts in the short run. There's no question. Some things are going to have negative impacts in the long run. Continuing to clear cut will, we know that, but you have a take permit and so on. So, so it just doesn't seem like you're going to be making major alterations to whatever research design you lay out on the landscape in these first 10 years that this FMP is in place. And so I'm not suggesting that adaptive management planning isn't important, but it seems like we're maybe getting a little high centered around this sort of fear of change, that we're not gonna be able to make change, or you'll make too much change. It seems like for a while you're going to kind of be just laying out your plan. Is that accurate?
If we could design the plan the way we would like to envision it, yes, but we know that that's probably not going to be possible. And that's where these little experiments come in, whether it's the riparian or the mammo and things like that. Those by design have said, you can't quite do everything you want to do yet because you have to prove something else first. And so that kind of built in, that's what's lending some uncertainty, I would say.
Okay.
And that might cause us a response. So just as a.
Can I
It's
Can
a
I jump in?
helpful-
Because
Yeah, I was just
I
gonna
need
come to
to,
you, Paul.
I
Sorry,
should have
Colin.
left 5 minutes ago. Sorry. I think in what you're talking about, the remodeling, I love that analogy because I think it's one of the laws of thermodynamics is that you go through a phase transition. When you go from a disorganized state to an organized state, there's movement, there's chaos. You don't know what the result is until you get to that final product. You do need to have stability in your experiment. That's really important. I don't think you need to legislate that or move that up to the land board to create that stability. The researchers at OSU and the board understand that. They can create that stability. We don't need to move that up to the land board to guarantee it. That shouldn't be an issue. We can have both. We can have the flexibility and the stability, and we don't need to create more bureaucracy to ensure it. So sorry, I'd love to stay on. This is good, but I'm already late for the next one.
Thanks, Paul. Appreciate you being here. Colin, go ahead, and then we'll get Ken.
Yeah, so Katie, you were talking about the need for kind of consistency in the research design as we're doing these manipulative experiments, and that touched on one of the first things that I saw when I was looking at this section. As I looked at the diagram, the adaptive management diagram, and what stood out to me was I saw that it was framed in terms of adaptive research, and which makes sense. But we also, we're going to be managing this forest, so we need to have a level of adaptive management as well. And that's something that I think has been missing from the other sections of the FMP as a whole, as well as this adaptive management section, is how do we develop the actual prescriptions that we're implementing at the stand or the unit level. I think that's touched on if you read the narrative under the diagram, that's touched on, but I think it needs to be brought more to the forefront. If you look at the diagram between the box E and box F, there probably needs to be another box that describes how you actually design experiments and how much room you have. And by experiments, I mean design the actual treatments. And by designing the treatments, I mean the stand level treatments. And we have a lot of room in the HCP and the research proposal to design treatments and experiments. If you take extensive, for example, we have sideboards of 20 to 80% retention. And within those sideboards, you could have any level of retention in between there. You could have homogenized retention that's even throughout the unit. You could have really clumpy retention. And what I'm curious, and what I think should be spelled out in the FMP is how do you make those decisions and maintain the overall integrity of the research design? So how much, how many replicates can you have? If you want to experiment with clumpiness, how many replicates do you have room for? How do you decide what those replicates look like as far as the actual treatment prescriptions? How do they get applied? And then through monitoring, how do you come back around and adjust those treatments, those manipulative experiments, and allow for adaptive management, but still maintain the overall integrity of the research design?
Yeah, let me just respond to that. That's a really insightful question, and I appreciate it a lot because it's one that I wrestle with a lot, and I think as many of the researchers on this project do. And that is, our experiment, our grand experiment is the triad experiment, right? The share versus spare. That's the grand experiment. And our replicates are the 10 different assignments of different treatments, right? At the grand scale. But as you say, we have to drill down to individual stands. And every stand on the Elliott pretty much has a different stand history. Some of them have been thin, some of them haven't, some of them have been logged and never clear cut. Some of them have been logged and clear cut. Some of them have just been clear cut. There's all these different responses built into the natural variation. So we need to have within our experimental design clear direction that we apply relatively evenly across all those replicates in order to be able to detect differences within the treatments at the larger scale. And so if, for example, sub-watershed 4, which is Footlog Creek, we decide we're gonna put, just clumpy extensive treatments in for whatever reason, and then another sub-watershed, like it's 119, I think we've been fighting with that one for a while. We decide to do them all dispersed. Well, then we don't have replicates, right? Because we're doing things very differently. And so understanding what the sideboards are and how we're going to apply them is an important part of the experimental design, so that we're not making ad hoc decisions that are different through time. So there's a temporal aspect to making these ad hoc decisions, and there is a spatial aspect to it. And so from a researcher, we have to be realistic that we can't control everything, that we have norms that we have to meet, and that, there's things that the biological system just won't do, even if we wanted it to. And there's things that the social system won't accommodate. And so that kind of figuring out what that is and how we're going to apply it uniformly through time and space is at the stand level is a really critical question, and one that we wrestle with a lot. And so I think you hit that nail on the head, is that unit level and how we do break it out. And that's really what we're trying to work through right now, as you're experiencing with the extensive treatments, is how do we specifically address the regulatory aspects, the biological reality of what the stand looks like, and the social aspects, and maintain it, experiment at the same time.
A lot to hold at once.
Mm-hmm.
Thanks for the question, the suggestion, Colin, for the response, Katie. Ken, maybe last reflection, comment, question from you on this topic, and then we'll try to transition, give some time to Gordy on the riparian aquatic stuff. But this has been really terrific. Thanks, everybody. Go ahead, Ken.
Yeah, thank you. I have a much more generalistic comment. I do love the discussion that's going on here, and I really like this adaptive management tiered approach. This seems to make sense to me from a perspective of a forest federal kind of planner in the past. But one of the things that that I think we need to really think about is our public engagement as we move forward. Anything that we're doing here, from the research experiment to the adaptive management to what we're doing with the T&E species, the public in general has a tendency to lock into a decision point somewhere. So when we ultimately have a forest plan, the public's going to lock into that. They're going to forget about it. They're going to either say everything's wrong with the Elliott or everything's right with the Elliott, and they're going to move on. Then we have a situation, and I'll go back to what Gordy said earlier about maybe leaving a certain amount of wood on the ground and causing a bark beetle infestation that causes us to have some substantial reason to rethink a treatment. We're going to have to come back, in my opinion, we're going to need to come back to our public engagement level and make sure the public understands why we're doing something major, like this, leaving a certain amount of wood on the ground versus not leaving it because we have the desired effect, or any type of adverse action that we create that has an adverse impact, specifically on riparian, particularly on riparian, if it's more sedimentation, if it's whatever, temperature issues. We just need to, I think, remember that we're going to have to come back kind of to ground zero on some of these major changes with the public, explain that we do have something called adaptive management involved with the forest plan, and here's how it works again, and here's what we're going to do, to kind of resolve an issue we might have, or maybe change the experimental design a bit. But just want to make sure that we are thinking long-term in our public engagement. That's really the point I had. Thank you.
Thanks, Ken. A helpful reminder to all of us of the importance of the communication side of why certain actions will be taking place, and that long-term perspective on that as well. So appreciate it. Any final reflections before we turn our attention to aquatic and riparian? Jazz hands and a raised hand. There you go, Colin. Enthusiastic question.
Frantically hitting buttons over here. I just had one last comment, which was as to the time frame for adaptive management. Some of the monitoring and adaptations are going to be long time frame, 10 or 20 years, but there's going to be a lot of realizations, I think, and need for change on a shorter time frame, like months or year, or a year or so. An example would just be operability. If we're laying out units and we realize that they're not operable, or that the operator is winding up having to cut leaf trees for safety or operations concerns, those sort of things are going to be apparent in a matter of months, not years. So I just wanted, and I think that's captured in this draft chapter, that there's going to be different feedback loops and different timeframes depending on the feedback loop. So wanted to emphasize that.
Thanks, Colin. All right, Shannon, you are up to give a high-level overview of the riparian, and then we'll an aquatic section and a chapter, excuse me, and then we'll look for some more good discussion.
Okay, sounds good. Thanks everyone for all of that feedback. This is a really helpful conversation, and we'll be continuing it. So just moving on very briefly, I have a couple of slides, but really wanted again to have this be more of a discussion, and Gordy is here to help with that, comments and questions. But just to look at the high level of the draft chapter that was sent out, you'll notice there were some sections that are still in development and more details being added that will be shared in the next version of this. But really the structure is laid out, as well as a lot of the details. So the current structure of that draft chapter is starting with a description of the stream network classification and riparian buffer delineation. This work was done at the research proposal phase. The current FMP has more detailed and updated descriptions, just trying to clarify what those classifications and delineations were based on, and how the riparian buffer system and is different in different areas of the forest, depending on stream network classification and which watershed protection zone you're in. So that was the first section. There's also a section on the riparian conservation strategy based on the categories that are laid out in the research proposal. So starting with the land treatment allocations, going through the riparian buffer system, the restoration experimental design, partnerships, roads. So all of those details are being fleshed out further in the forest management plan, but it ties back very clearly to the research proposal. The third piece is looking at research and restoration goals and objectives. And there was an early version of this section that was shared back in July with this FMP working group that we got some comments on and are continuing to develop that section and incorporate feedback that we've been getting. But this really lays out the overall goals for the riparian and aquatic research, restoration as part of that research, and then objectives and more specific guidance. It is similar in structure to the extensive section. So where you're starting with broader goals, objectives, and then management guidance under that. And then a final category here is looking at specifics of experimental designs. And this draft has a more detailed approach of the riparian restoration treatment experiment, and includes a table that shows the proposed approach. Again, this is all for stands less than 65 years old in riparian areas as of 2020. But the experiment looks at two main categories of allocations: fish-bearing streams and non-fish-bearing streams, and then aligns these with the different treatment types that would be upslope or immediately adjacent to that, that reach of the stream. You can see there's a number of replicates outlined here, reach lengths, and then estimated acres based on that information. So Gordy, this was my last slide just on the high level overview, but wanted to turn it over to Gordy to explain this a little bit more and then hopefully open it up for discussion and questions.
Okay, well, thank you, Shannon. So what you're seeing here is what we're proposing as a way to do an initial assessment of the riparian restoration effort that we will do on the Elliott. And as Shannon said, this is only to stands less than 65 years of age as of 2020. And the other part of this, it includes fish-bearing and non-fish-bearing streams. And I think what's really unique about this effort is that we're focusing on the non-fish-bearing streams. To date, in terms of restoration, these we have received absolutely no consideration with regard to restoration. And we know, and we're learning, the more we learn, the more we recognize that these are ecologically important. So we feel like this focus on the non-fish-bearing streams is a major, will be a major contribution of work on the Elliott to our understanding of aquatic ecosystem, and potentially, I think, making a major contribution to making our system more productive moving forward in the future. So what you see here is a proposed approach to doing this, where we're going to look at the treatment, again, at thinning, and it's down to about 80, I want to say 80 square feet per acre of basal area, is what we, in discussions with foresters, they feel is the appropriate level to go to get larger trees back into the riparian areas. And we're also looking at trying to get hardwood back in many cases. And so what you're seeing here is the thinnings in the intensive, extensive, the MRW, the CR, and then the CRWs. And so we propose this to do an initial assessment of the effect of the riparian restoration. So then we would, at the end of this period, which is roughly 5 years, we have a 2-year pre-treatment assessment, and then followed by 3 years of post-treatment. And at the end of that 5-year period, we would do an evaluation of the potential effectiveness of this work. We approached it this way in part for the HCP, because again, of the novelty of being able to, of proposing to do restoration work within the entirety of the designated riparian areas. NIMF was a little skeptical of that. So this is the approach we're trying to lay out to deal with this. Can we go back to, and Shannon, can you go back to that previous slide? I want to point something out. The slide here, the picture that Jeff Behan takes. One of the things that's emerging with regard to the Elliott is as we look at more and more of that system, and we start talking about not just the riparian restoration, but the in-channel restoration. The Elliott appears, many streams in the Elliott appear to be sediment starved. It's down to bedrock. And this is from a system productivity system, this is not making that system productive at all. And so there's a challenge we have is we're going to have to begin to the aggradation of these channels to begin to get sediment levels built back up into them for a number of different reasons. I would think, and it's something that we will look into, you know, there's some issues on the Elliott with water temperatures. I don't think it has to do with riparian vegetation as much. It has to do with as much of the exposed bedrock. And so that bedrock is just warming up and it becomes a major heat source during the summer. And so what we're looking at here is through the riparian restoration, because remember, we're going to be putting trees into the channel, as well as the active restoration, is one, to begin to grade the channel, these channels, but also in grading the channel, we're going to start reconnecting the floodplain. Right now, there's very little connection between the off-channel areas and these streams in the Elliott and those floodplains. And we know those are really important, particularly for the production and survival of fish. So we're looking at this in this effort. There's going to be a really, I think, a concerted effort to look at getting these channels re-graded, and that means you know, how do we begin to get the sediment to accumulate in these channels? So that'll be a major part of both the riparian restoration in terms of the wood addition, as well as the work on direct in-channel restoration. That's something that we hadn't considered initially, but I think the more we go out and the more we look at the Elliott, it's going to be a major challenge in this work. So
Thanks.
Yeah, so I just quickly, that's where we're at with this.
Appreciate it. I think it looks like Bob Salinger, you've got a comment or a question there.
Yeah, I guess a couple of questions. One is, I think we continue to be fish centric, and so I think it's important, and I'd like to hear your thoughts on this. I mean, looking at other species and how they're affected by it, especially on those non-fish streams, and I'm thinking about salamanders, and particularly ones that get higher up in the system, like the southern torrents, and also birds. You know, because I think we tend to focus everything on fish, not just on the Elliott, but elsewhere as well. And so I see this as a pretty big opportunity to look at some of the other species and how they benefit. I think also that needs to be long-term, because if you look at the hard rock studies from Washington, it shows that, you know, the responses that occur in the first 7 years may be very different from the second 7. So,
Sure.
and then the other thing I just want to get more clarity on was when you talk about non-fish bearing, are you talking about the small perennials? Is there any of this up into the seasonals as well? Because I think that's a place where we really are lacking data in terms of understanding the benefits of leaving trees along the seasonals.
Yeah. Well, let me back up, and you know, I want to point out that the non-fish bearing stream particularly is there's going to be a major amphibian component to that. We know that in many cases, these non-fish bearing streams are actually the biodiversity hotspots for amphibians. And again, you know, they haven't received much attention. And I think this restoration effort, and we're working with folks like Tiffany Garcia from OSU, and talking to other people about how do we monitor amphibians as part of this effort, because that's going to be a major beneficiary of this work, I think. And secondly, you're right, Bob, about the birds. You know, one of the things we're going to be doing is trying to reestablish large trees along these zones, and we know that those trees can be used, particularly in the upper portions of that network, are potential habitat for both murrelets and owls. And again, this is an area that hasn't received much direct effort in the past, and I'm hoping we can shift that, because you know, this is upwards of 70, 80, 90% of the network is these small headwater streams, and we're not giving them, I think, their just attention. And so I'm hoping that we can begin to move things forward with this. We've got you know, our fish bearing network now is up to 20% gradient, which is well past anything that's been done previously. So we're capturing a lot of those small perennial streams, as you ask about. They're in that fish bearing classification. And then the others, again, we're affording that don't fall into that where they get really steep. We're looking at, again, what's going to happen there, you know, from an ecological perspective. Regarding the designation of the non-fish bearing network, it has to do with the delivery potential from landslide to the channel. We've got the top 25% right now as part in the areas outside of the, I mean, the top 25% of those streams would have the potential to deliver fish bearing streams are designated as a non-fish bearing network. But in the reserves, in the CRW, and then the reserves of the MRW, and in many cases, what we'll see with the extensive is we're covering 100% of the streams. I mean, right now, I think something like 87% of the headwater streams are getting full coverage in the Elliott, and that's you know, essentially a 200-foot buffer. Now we haven't designated all of those streams as riparian conservation areas, because essentially we would cover the whole Elliott up in an RCA if we were to do that. And so to maintain flexibility for other areas, we haven't done that. But the reality is we've got extensive areas, coverage of the stream network. And then with regard to the fish bearing streams and the other important organisms, so there, you know, we look at lampreys. There's going to be a critical organism to look at, and there's going to be some really interesting I think dichotomies there. If you want to have lampreys, you have to have fine sediments. But the accumulation of fine sediments is not something we generally strive for in restoration efforts. So we'll be looking at these trade-offs about if you want to have lampreys, you got to have some fine sediments. What does that mean ecologically? So for example, if we can reconnect the floodplains and we got fine sediments, that can be particularly important for fish that just emerge. Because juvenile salmona that just emerge don't have a large swimming capacity, so they need to get into slower water. If they can get into areas that have these fine sediments, those are hotspots for midges, which can be an important food source for juvenile fish. But then you've got the issue of sedimentation and decreased survival of eggs and fry. So, you know, it's going to be, I think what we can be able to do is highlight trade-offs here in this research. It's talk about that. Yes, we can have, you know, the pluses and minuses all the way through the system, and how to, and let people know about that, and that can help inform both management and management related decisions. So I see it as being much more comprehensive than fish. We may, you know, our terminology may not suggest that, but I think in the document we talk about the importance of these systems for non-fish organisms.
Yeah, no, I throw freshwater mussels into that mix as well. So one last thing to put kind of a fine point on one of the things I'm looking for, and you kind of answered in here, but one of the things we're really interested in, it came up a lot in the private forest accords, was the role of seasonal streams, intermittent streams, seeps, isolated seeps and springs, and so on, in terms of amphibian survival, in terms of overridge migration, connections between streams. That was a bone of contention. And basically they wound up getting pretty much left unprotected other than equipment exclusion zones. So one of the things we're really interested in is seeing if there can be doing some research done on the Elliott that actually really looks at that. And, you know, obviously in the big reserves, they're fully protected, but what I'm after is, you know, if you leave some trees along those intermittent streams, do you see a difference, for example, in amphibian presence along that whole corridor? When do you see it? Are they actually going over the tops of the ridges? You know, how much do you have to leave? And so I think that whole intermittent stream issue and isolated seeps and springs is even, there's even more of a question mark than the non-fish. So
yeah, no, I totally agree with you. And you know, I think one of the more interesting aspects of this will be, you know, we're going to have the RCA is going to extend into some of the intensive units. So we're trying to reestablish a riparian conservation area in an area that's been previously ignored, and reestablishing that. How does is there a recolonization that would occur? We were out in the field with Tiffany Garcia, and this was a major topic of discussion as we do this restoration effort, and particularly in these intensive areas where they haven't had a riparian zone for 50, 60 years, and we reestablish that on the landscape. What's the response? And you know, and then looking at those, and you know, are those then the corridors which that overridge movement can occur in these types of units? I think we've got to. It may not be coming out as strongly as maybe it should, but we're really thinking about that stuff and starting to talk to people who can do that work and to make it a central focus of the aquatic effort.
Cool.
Thank
you.
Yeah.
Thanks for the comments, Bob. Thanks for the responses, Gordy. Ken, you came up and then went back down. Did you have something you wanted to add?
Oh, Gordy answered it in that 20% gradient on the string part.
Okay, thanks. All right. Shannon, did you have more slides and information you wanted to cover?
No, I don't.
All right. Any other sort of questions, comments from the advisory committee? Yeah, Colin.
Yeah, I was just curious about the requirement that there's no wood removal within 120 feet of streams. I think we talked about this a little bit before, but I was wanting clarification, is that on all riparian zones, or is it only fish bearing? And
No, all.
all, okay. And I mean, my understanding was originally the intent was that we would have active management, including harvest and removal, you know, that promoted restoration in those areas, and that there was some pushback from nymphs on this issue. You know, I'm just wondering, it's frustrating to me anytime that there's an emphasis on what's leaving the forest versus what the conditions are that we're promoting. And it seems like this is really an emphasis on what we're removing rather than what we're promoting and what we want to see. I'm just curious how that conversation with nymphs went, and if there's any room for some flexibility there. I mean, I think that this, I saw this as an opportunity to develop some treatments that could be applied, not just on the Elliott, but on other lands, especially industrial lands.
Right.
And the bottom line is that, you know, industrial landowners are not going to apply treatments if they can't remove wood from those areas. So I'm just wanted to get your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, you know, what we initially suggested was that you needed to leave, let me get the numbers straight. I think it was somewhere, if you needed to devote 15 to 20% of the volume removed to the channel to make up for to offset the potential wood loss from the thinnings. You know, in my mind, part of the experimental design should be to try to, you know, do you leave 10% of the wood? Do you leave 90% of the other wood in those zones? But nymphs is swallowing hard on this one, man. They you know, this is going against counter to how they've managed streams before, which is no activity within that 120 feet zone. And this was about as far as they were comfortable going. If we need to leave the wood, we can't take it. But again, this issue had just, you know, as I said earlier, this just come to our attention about the Douglas fir bark beetle, and potential issues with that. And we haven't had a real discussion with them about if that would allow us then to remove some trees to, you know, because it's a new twist on the design. You know, can we remove 50% of the trees from that zone and doing that? So I look at this as, okay, we got our foot in the door, and maybe through adaptive management down the road, we get to try some different things.
Okay.
Colin, could you comment on what it would cost to fell the trees and leave them? What you would be charged per acre just to fell? And if you had that in a contract?
I think it would really depend on, you know, how many trees per acre. You know, it wouldn't. Yeah, I mean, it would really depend. I think I could
Probably on
get
the order of, let's say, 150 to 200 per acre.
Yeah, I mean, I might. Yeah, I just off the top of my head, I would think maybe a little bit more, maybe 500 an acre.
Yeah, Ryan Singleton said about 600. That'd be to do it by hand.
Yeah, that sounds about right. I mean, if you were doing what, you know, thinning to, you know, 80 square foot basal area, that seems reasonable.
Thanks, Colin. Ken?
Gordy, has there been any discussion about the concept of multiple entries on falling these, you know, X number of trees per acre and putting them on the ground in terms of the Doug fir bark beetle. In other words, come in and maybe take 30 or 40% of the trees, wait 5 years and come in for another 30 or 40%?
No, there hasn't, Ken. Right now, the way NIMF wanted it was a one-time entry. The bark beetle issue had, what, in the last month or two, Katie? It's come up. I'm hoping maybe between the draft HCP and what's finalized that we will have a more thorough discussion about potential options to deal with that. And maybe that's where something like that could happen.
And perhaps Colin has a better concept than I do.
Yeah.
Of how much wood needs to be on the ground to create an infestation of beetles. But my experience is it's a considerable volume before you get a really widespread bark beetle infestation. It's not small numbers of trees. It's usually more related to blow down patches and that kind of thing.
Okay.
What about the temporal nature? Because we'll be entering stands annually, let's say, and felling trees, and then moving on to the next stand and felling trees, and if you look at the CRW, for example, over 20 years, if you're going to be in there every year felling trees, it might be over the ridge top, or it might be downstream or upstream from where you worked last year, but it's going to be like a mini blowdown every year instead of once every 10 years or something. So there's a temporal regularity to it as well as a spatial proximity. And I didn't know how that affects bark beetles. If you had any thoughts there.
I think, again, just observational experience in the Coast Range. You need, a bit of a concentration to have, an infestation, if you will. And it takes a bit of time for that to develop. It's not like a 1 or 2 year development. It's 3 or 4 or 5. Again, Colin, jump in here anytime. You've got more experience than I do. It does take a little bit of time to develop, and if the wood's taken out as the infestation starts to develop, then it can essentially go away. If there's more environmental impacts, the warming, global warming is certainly a thought about bark beetle infestations. I know that, some of the Intermountain Range and the Rockies and stuff, just the amount of drying is really exacerbating bark beetles there. It's it's a different beetle, but still the same kind of of a life history. Colin, jump in, help me out here.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, usually when you see bark beetles in the West and in the Coast Range, it's where you have a big fire event. You have a big flush of dead trees all at once. So, I can't really think of a real analog to what we're going to be doing, which will be creating on an annual basis pockets where there's a high concentration of down logs. So, yeah, I don't know, and I'm not a insect guy. We don't have those as much here in the Coast Range as they do south of us or to the east. So, yeah, it's a question I have as well. I think the other concerns that would limit, this approach being applied on other lands is just going to be, fire access for fire, having to cut a fire line through an area, and given that these are not just the fish-bearing streams, but they're ephemeral and intermittent streams as well, that could be problematic, and that would be, or I think it will be a deal breaker, asking any sort of private or industrial landowner to implement this sort of treatment on their lands. So yeah, that's a big concern that I have with the HCP, and honestly, I think that NIMS is overstepping their bounds in requiring this. You know, they, under the ESA, they're required, they have the ability to, you know, recommend mitigation. And they can, you know, require mitigation if it's required to get below a jeopardy determination. But I think this goes well beyond what the agencies are can require under the ESA. So I think it's definitely concerning for me, and something that we'll probably be bringing up in our comments to the agencies.
I think also, you know, maybe there's an opportunity here for some, you know, some more research from an insect perspective. But Colin makes a really good point. Operational can be really a difficulty for repeat entries if you've got X number of trees on the ground when you're trying to do some other work.
Yeah, I mean, you know, I'm glad you guys, you're glad for these comments, because it's really helpful. This had been, you know, one of the more contentious parts of the HCP, is because this is totally going against what NIMS has allowed or considered appropriate previously. And so in my mind, I'm just happy to get an opportunity to try it. And I think this is gonna be a major step forward in terms of management, and particularly from a conservation perspective. It would be great if we had more flexibility to do some of the things that you guys are pointing out. But like I say, right now, it's been a you know, a long road just to get to where we're at.
Yeah, I'm sure and I want to commend you on working with them. I'm sure it's been a lot of work. You know, the tribes have gone through the same sort of thing with nymphs, and they want to stick to their policies, which aren't always necessarily science-based, but that's what they're comfortable with. So I just want to sympathize with you and recognize that it's not always easy working with the agencies and getting them to recognize advances in science.
Thanks, Colin. Thanks, Ken, for the feedback, input, good conversation. Any other comments or questions from the committee or OSU team? Anything else you were hoping to get feedback on? All right. Oh, Shannon, go ahead.
No, I was just gonna say, I think these were two of the major areas that we were really hoping to get feedback on today. So thanks for the discussion, everyone.
Yeah, and I don't think we have any members of the public. Any members of the public that wish to make comments? Now's a chance. All right. Hearing none. Next meeting of this group, so the FMP work group, is 11 a.m. on October 24. There's more work that's obviously going to be happening between meetings. You know, additional chapters, updated chapters, as Shannon mentioned at the outset. Work is ongoing to try to get those updated and onto a regularly updated sort of platform, online platform, the OSU website. So that should be happening soon. Keep an eye, we'll keep you posted on that. And lots of you know, updates coming into your email, so keep an eye on them as well. And if you have Colin, I think you mentioned you had taken some sort of track changes, suggestions into these documents. Sure appreciate anybody sending those comments, suggestions, track changes, edits to Shannon and team, so they can consider them as they work through next iterations.
Peter, there was, I had on my calendar an October 14th hold date for a roads discussion. Is that still on?
That is still on. It's not a full work group meeting, a dedicated conversation to the topic of roads and how to address it. And that relates to, I think, the HCP, but also potentially FMP.
Great, thank you.
Thanks. See you all. Meeting adjourned.
Bye, folks.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.